In the early years of World War II, the United States watched from afar as Europe descended into chaos. Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany had swiftly conquered Poland, France was under occupation, and Britain stood alone against relentless German bombing. Across the Pacific, the Japanese Empire was expanding aggressively. But despite the turmoil, most Americans were reluctant to join the fight. The scars of World War I were still fresh, and the prevailing sentiment was to stay out of Europe's conflict. President Franklin D. Roosevelt faced a difficult balancing act. On one hand, he sympathized with the Allies, providing them with supplies and aid through programs like Lend-Lease. On the other, many Americans demanded neutrality. But everything changed on a single, terrible day, December 7, 1941. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was swift and devastating. In just 2 hours, more than 2,400 American servicemen and civilians lost their lives. Battleships burned, aircraft were destroyed, and the U.S. Pacific Fleet was crippled. Overnight, the United States was thrust into war. The nation's response was fierce and united. Roosevelt called for a declaration of war, and Congress responded almost unanimously. America was no longer an observer, it was a combatant. The country shifted into wartime mode with remarkable speed. Factories that once produced cars, radios, and household goods converted to manufacturing tanks, planes, and weapons. Women flooded the workforce, taking on roles that had been traditionally male-dominated. The entire country was mobilized. Yet, American troops were largely inexperienced in ground combat. Their first major test came in the deserts of North Africa. In November 1942, under the code name Operation Torch, American and British forces launched their first joint offensive against Axis-controlled territories. Landing in Morocco and Algeria, the Allies aimed to push eastward and trap the German-Italian forces led by the legendary Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. Known as the Desert Fox for his cunning tactics and swift maneuvers, Rommel was a formidable opponent. The American soldiers, fresh from training camps back home, were shocked by the reality of desert warfare: scorching heat, sandstorms, and a relentless enemy. The Battle of Kasserine Pass in Tunisia was a harsh introduction. Rommel's Afrika Korps exploited the Americans' lack of experience, launching a powerful counterattack that forced U.S. forces into retreat. Communications broke down, supply lines were stretched thin, and morale wavered. It was clear that the American military had much to learn. But failure bred resolve. Commanders restructured leadership, and General George S. Patton was brought in to inject discipline and aggressive tactics. Troops received better training, and coordination between British and American forces improved significantly. Gradually, the tide turned. The Allies advanced, forcing Rommel's forces into a desperate retreat. By May 1943, the combined Allied armies had cornered the Axis troops, compelling them to surrender in North Africa. This victory was a pivotal moment. It was the first major ground triumph for the United States in World War II and a huge morale booster for the Allies. North Africa's liberation opened the door for the invasion of Italy. In July 1943, Allied forces landed in Sicily and began a grueling campaign to push Mussolini's fascist regime from power. Fighting in Italy was brutal, characterized by mountainous terrain, harsh weather, and tenacious German resistance. Despite these challenges, the Allies slowly advanced, and Rome fell in June 1944. Meanwhile, the United States continued to ramp up its war production and prepare for an even greater challenge, opening a Western front in Europe. The lessons learned in North Africa and Italy had hardened American troops and commanders, readying them for the battles ahead. By the end of 1943, America had transformed from a hesitant bystander into a formidable force, poised to strike at the heart of Nazi Germany. The nation's journey from isolation to fire had only just begun. Storming Europe, D-Day and the road to victory. By the spring of 1944, the world was holding its breath. After years of brutal fighting and sacrifice, the Allies were ready to open the long-awaited Western Front against Nazi Germany. The Soviet Union had been bleeding the German army on the Eastern Front, but the tide could only truly turn if the Allies struck at the heart of Western Europe. The plan was audacious: a massive amphibious invasion of Nazi-occupied France. Operation Overlord, better known as D-Day, was the largest seaborne invasion in history. Months of secret planning, deception, and preparation culminated on the dawn of June 6, 1944. On that morning, under cold, grey skies, over 156,000 American, British, Canadian, and Allied troops landed on 5 beaches along the Normandy coast. The Americans were assigned Omaha and Utah beaches, where they faced some of the fiercest resistance. At Omaha Beach, the landing was a nightmare. Soldiers hit the water amidst heavy machine gun fire, barbed wire, landmines, and treacherous obstacles designed to stop them. Many drowned in the surf or fell before they could reach the shore. But despite the chaos and carnage, the American troops fought with unmatched courage and tenacity. Inch by inch, they took ground, breaking through Hitler's Atlantic Wall. On Utah Beach, the landing was smoother but still perilous. American forces quickly secured the beach and pushed inland, linking up with airborne units dropped behind enemy lines during the night. These paratroopers had a dangerous mission: to disrupt German communications, capture key bridges, and sow confusion. Their bravery was critical in the overall success of the invasion. Across the beaches, British and Canadian forces also fought fiercely, facing their own share of resistance but making steady progress. By nightfall, the Allies had established a foothold in Normandy, a fragile but crucial beachhead. The fighting, however, was far from over. The weeks following D-Day were a brutal slog through the French countryside. The Allies fought through dense hedgerows, marshlands, and towns, encountering stiff German resistance at every turn. Cities like Caen were heavily contested, changing hands multiple times and turning into wastelands. One of the war's most desperate battles came in December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge. The Germans launched a surprise counterattack through the Ardennes forest in Belgium, hoping to split the Allied lines and capture the vital port of Antwerp. American forces were caught off guard, suffering heavy losses and brutal winter conditions. Yet, the resilience of the American soldiers shone brightest in this dark hour. Surrounded and outnumbered, units like those in the town of Bastogne held firm against overwhelming odds. General Anthony McAuliffe's famous reply of "nuts" to a German demand for surrender became a symbol of defiance and grit. Slowly but surely, the Allies repelled the German offensive, and by January 1945, the front lines were back where they had started. The Battle of the Bulge had inflicted heavy casualties but marked the beginning of the final push into Germany. As winter thawed into spring, Allied forces crossed the Rhine River, entering the heartland of Nazi Germany. Cities were bombed relentlessly, factories destroyed, and civilians caught in the crossfire. The war became a grim march of liberation and destruction. On April 30, 1945, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his Berlin bunker. Just days later, on May 7, Germany surrendered unconditionally. Victory in Europe. VE Day was celebrated with joyous relief around the world. The price had been staggering. Over 400,000 American soldiers had died in the European theater, and millions more had been wounded. Entire nations lay in ruins, but freedom had been restored. For the United States, D-Day and the liberation of Europe were proof of its rising power and resolve. The young soldiers who had faced hell on the beaches of Normandy had helped bring down one of history's most brutal regimes. From Pacific fire to a new world dawn. While the guns in Europe fell silent, another fierce battle was raging across the vast Pacific Ocean. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States found itself locked in a brutal war against Japan, a conflict that would test the resolve, courage, and innovation of American forces like never before. In the early days of the Pacific War, Japan had the upper hand. They quickly seized territories across Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands, including the Philippines, Guam, and Wake Island. The Japanese Navy was a powerful force, and their pilots skilled in the deadly art of kamikaze attacks. But the tide began to turn with the Battle of Midway in June 1942. This was a critical naval battle where the U.S. Navy, using intelligence and code breaking, ambushed the Japanese fleet. In just a few days, the Americans sank 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, crippling Japan's ability to launch large-scale naval offensives. Midway was a turning point. The U.S. was now on the offensive. The island-hopping campaign that followed was grueling. Rather than attacking every Japanese-held island, the U.S. targeted strategically important ones to gradually move closer to Japan. Each battle was bloody and fierce. The fight for Guadalcanal was a brutal test of jungle warfare, disease, and enemy resistance. 2 of the bloodiest battles came later in 1945, Iwo Jima and Okinawa. At Iwo Jima, American Marines faced a fortress island defended by tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers who refused to surrender. The iconic image of Marines raising the American flag atop Mount Suribachi captured the immense sacrifice and determination of the battle. Okinawa was even more devastating, the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific, lasting nearly 3 months with horrific casualties on both sides. The battle foreshadowed the potentially massive cost of invading mainland Japan. Back in the United States, the race to develop a secret weapon was reaching its climax. The Manhattan Project was working furiously to produce the atomic bomb, a weapon with the power to instantly obliterate entire cities. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. The destruction was catastrophic, killing over 100,000 people instantly and causing untold suffering afterward. Facing annihilation, Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, bringing World War II to a close. The war had changed the world. The United States emerged as a superpower with unmatched military and economic strength. But the devastation left behind demanded rebuilding and healing. Enter the Marshall Plan, a bold initiative launched in 1947 to rebuild war-torn Europe. Under the plan, the U.S. provided over $12 billion in aid to help European nations recover economically and politically. The Marshall Plan helped prevent the spread of communism and laid the foundation for decades of peace and prosperity. The war also shaped the post-war global order. The United Nations was established to promote international cooperation and prevent future conflicts. The United States took a leading role in forming alliances like NATO, standing as a bulwark against Soviet expansion during the Cold War. World War II was a crucible that tested the mettle of a nation. From hesitant isolation to the fiery battles on distant shores, the American people sacrificed, innovated, and ultimately helped shape a new world. Their courage and resolve left a legacy that still echoes today.